This is what happens when we hire based on sympathy rather than standards. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before the power surge that would end his career. St. Michael's Hospital ICU, San Diego, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical drone over 26 beds, the antiseptic smell mixing with floor wax and something darker underneath, the smell of people whose bodies were failing them. Brooke Sullivan charted vitals at Station 3, her pen moving across the clipboard with the kind of precision that made each notation look like a signature on a will. Her shoulders were narrow, her posture the shape of someone who had learned long ago to take up as little space as possible. The badge lanyard around her neck held her hospital credentials and something else, a tarnished challenge coin she kept from Bagram, worn smooth by her thumb. She touched it once every shift, morning rounds, a private ritual performed while the other staff moved past her without seeing. The ICU smelled like they always did at 6:15 a.m., before the day nurses arrived in force. Quiet. Watchful. Machines breathing for people who had forgotten how. Brooke moved between beds with the kind of invisible efficiency that made her dangerous, the way a shadow is dangerous only when you realize it's been there the whole time. She wore long sleeves despite the San Diego heat, sleeves that covered rope-burned scars on her forearms, scars that had their own stories. Stories that were supposed to be buried. Stories that had been legally erased by a Pentagon that operated in a basement 2 levels below everything the world could see. Dr. Richard Caldwell stood in the doorway of the ICU at 6:14 a.m., his white coat pressed like a knife edge, his eyes moving across the nurses with the calculation of a man counting assets. He was tall in the way that some men are tall, not from physical height alone but from the way the space around him seemed to reorganize itself to make room for his presence. His hair was silver now, artfully silver, the kind that suggested good genetics and a dermatologist who kept his skin from looking weathered. He had been the head of cardiothoracic surgery at St. Michael's for 14 years. His uncle sat on the hospital board. His surgical outcomes were 4 percentage points below the national standard. Nobody said anything about that. His reputation was built on the kind of institutional protection that money could buy and a family name could reinforce. He watched Brooke as she helped a new resident with a peripheral for on a post-operative patient, a man 2 days out from a valve replacement. The resident's hand was shaking slightly, the needle wavering. Brooke said nothing. She simply took the resident's wrist and adjusted the angle, not harshly, not controlling, just a gentle correction of physics. The needle went in clean. No second stick. No hematoma. The resident's eyes widened slightly, that moment of surprise when someone shows you something you didn't know you were doing wrong. Caldwell's expression didn't change. But his jaw tightened. Just barely. Just enough. What happened next began with his voice echoing through the ICU during grand rounds, his tone taking on the cadence of a man performing for an audience of 12 attending physicians and residents who stood behind him in a half-circle. Brooke continued charting. She did not look up. Looking up would have been a form of acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have been a form of resistance, and resistance was not in her operational manual. This is what happens when we hire based on sympathy rather than standards, Caldwell said, gesturing toward Brooke without looking at her directly, as if she were a piece of equipment requiring annotation. Nurse Sullivan here took 3 attempts to place a central line yesterday. 3. On a patient who was unstable. Wasting time. Wasting resources. Wasting our credibility in front of the surgical team. He paused, letting that sink into the minds of the residents who were still developing their hierarchies, still learning which doctors were safe to contradict and which ones were not. This is why we cannot allow sentiment to override standards. This is what slipping looks like. Brooke's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Her hands remained perfectly steady as she continued charting vitals without a single glance in his direction. The other nurses at Station 3 suddenly became very absorbed in their own work, the universal movement of people who had learned the difference between witnessing and participating in another person's humiliation. The new resident looked down at his shoes. In bed 7, a Navy SEAL recovering from a training accident watched her face and saw nothing break there. Saw that everything she felt was happening behind walls so thick and so well constructed that not a single crack showed on the surface. He saw that, and something in his expression changed slightly, like a man recognizing a skill set he had trained for. The grand rounds moved on. Caldwell continued through the other beds, discussing cases with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to sound authoritative while saying very little of actual substance. Brooke charted. Her pen did not shake. Her breathing remained steady. The challenge coin hung against her collarbone, invisible under her scrubs. 38 minutes later, she was at the vending machine in the break room, inserting dollar bills with the kind of mechanical patience that came from not wanting to be anywhere else. 2 board members stood around the corner, their voices carrying the way voices do when people believe they are beyond the radius of consequence. Dr. Caldwell was telling them about his concerns regarding St. Michael's upcoming Joint Commission review, the regulatory body that arrived unannounced to evaluate hospital safety and procedure. His tone was the tone of a man carrying an enormous and growing responsibility. Nurse Sullivan's concerning performance patterns, he said, and Brooke heard the word patterns a move through the conversation like a knife finding joints. 3 attempts at a central line. That kind of inconsistency reflects poorly on our department. Reflects poorly on the hospital, frankly, especially with Joint Commission next month. They're going to look at everything. Every error. Every pattern. We need staff who enhance our standing with regulatory bodies, not jeopardize it. Brookskin fell into the vending machine slot with a metallic thud. She retrieved it without turning around. The break room suddenly felt very small, very enclosed, like the inside of a box that was slowly being sealed. She opened the can. She drank. And then she walked back to the ICU as if she had heard nothing, as if her career was not being systematically dismantled in a conversation 42 feet away. What they did not understand, what Caldwell could not have understood, was that she had survived worse than a vending machine conversation. She had survived mountains called Hindu Kush. She had survived a field hospital being overrun by forces that did not wear uniforms and followed no rules of engagement. She had survived by becoming very good at the thing she was doing right now, moving forward without breaking, without making sound, without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her fracture under pressure. At her station, she returned to her charts. The numbers were real. The vitals were real. The patient in bed 7 was real, a Navy SEAL named Marcus Chen, 32 years old, recovering from a training accident that had torn the rotator cuff of his right shoulder. He had been watching her the entire time, and when she returned to her charting, he did something that surprised them both. He smiled. Not a flirtation. Not a grimace. A smile of recognition. Caldwell was waiting for her at her station when she finished her charting for the next patient. He held a single sheet of paper, a write-up form, already filled out in the careful handwriting of the hospital's administrative staff. Insubordination, the form read. The date was yesterday. The time was listed as 14:48, which was before the central line placement had even finished. Caldwell did not hand it to her. He laid it down on her desk as if it were a calling card. His voice was very quiet. If you question my clinical decisions again, I will have security escort you out. Are we clear? Brooke looked at the form. She read every word, the kind of careful reading that indicates she was memorizing not just what was written but what was left unsaid. She knew what this was. She knew it was retaliation. She knew it was designed to create a paper trail that would make firing her look like a documented performance management process rather than what it actually was, elimination. She also knew that fighting it would only make things worse. And she had spent the last 4 years learning how to survive by not fighting things. By being invisible. By waiting. She signed the form without a word. Caldwell watched her sign, and something flickered across his face, not satisfaction, exactly, but the absence of resistance. The absence of a fight. He collected the form and walked away, his white coat moving through the ICU like a shark through shallow water. Later, during a difficult thoracotomy repair on a patient whose lungs were failing, her shift partner, a man named James Mercer, former Army medic, 12 years and 73 days of service before the IED took his right leg below the knee, noticed something when he was assisting Brooke with the surgical prep. She was suturing with a pattern that should not have been taught in civilian nursing school, a pattern that belonged to a field hospital outside Bagram, a pattern that required you to close a chest cavity with the understanding that you might not have more than 90 seconds before the patient coded again. It was a 3-layer closure, economical and strong, the kind of stitch that kept people alive when the infrastructure of modern medicine was not available. James stopped his prep work. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. And he said very quietly, "That's a Bagram stitch pattern. 3-layer field closure." He paused. Where does civilian nurse learn trauma surgery like that? Brooke did not stop working. Her hands continued their suturing, the needle moving in and out with the precision of muscle memory, the kind of muscle memory that only comes from repetition measured in dozens of lives rather than dozens of hours. She said nothing. She did not need to say anything. James Mercer had served on active duty. He knew that some stories belonged to a place called classified, a place where the government kept the things it needed to deny. "Right," he said finally, returning to his prep work. "That's what I thought." The day continued. Patients were monitored. Vitals were recorded. The challenge coin hung against her collarbone, a weight that felt heavier with each hour. Brooke moved through the ICU like a ghost moving through a house it used to haunt, present but not quite there, attached but already gone. At 2:19 a.m., the power surge hit St. Michael's Hospital. It came without warning, a spike in the electrical grid 2 blocks away, transforming half a second of current into a catastrophic cascade that killed the backup generators in sequence. The ICU went dark. Not gradually dark. Dark. The kind of dark that makes the world contract to whatever you can touch, whatever you can immediately see by the light of a flashlight someone produced 3 seconds after the monitors went dead. In bed 7, the Navy SEAL's heart monitor flatlined. The machine was searching for a signal that no longer existed. The patient was searching for a heartbeat that no longer found its rhythm. Everything after that happened in the dark, with only the beam of a flashlight cutting through the chaos, and a nurse who moved not like she was learning how to save a life but like she was remembering how to save one, hands moving with the precision of someone who had held together bodies in conditions far worse than these, in hospitals that were not hospitals at all but ruins with a blood type and a prayer. The monitor flatlined at 2:47 a.m., its silence louder than any alarm. Brooke heard it first, not the absence of sound, but the absence of rhythm, the way a heartbeat stops sounding like life and starts sounding like a mistake. The backup generators should have fired within 10 seconds. They didn't. Emergency lighting should have flooded the ICU in a wash of red. It didn't. What came instead was absolute darkness, the kind that made even seasoned nurses hold their breath, and Brooke was moving before her conscious mind caught up to her body's memory. Bed 7. Lieutenant Marcus Chen. Navy SEAL, recovering well from his abdominal surgery, stable vitals for the last 6 hours, and now his breathing pattern had changed, shallow, rapid, desperate. Brooke reached his bedside in 4 strides, her flashlight clenched between her teeth like a cigar, the beam cutting through the darkness in a single vertical line. She found his carotid pulse with 2 fingers, searching for the familiar rhythm. What she found was a flutter, weak, thready, fading like a radio signal losing transmission. His jugular veins were distended, bulging at the sides of his neck like someone was inflating them from the inside. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid building in the pericardial sac, the membrane around his heart, compressing the cardiac chambers until they couldn't fill, couldn't pump, couldn't sustain life. The pressure had to be released in the next 3 minutes or the damage became irreversible. 3 minutes was a long time. 3 minutes was nothing. "Crash cart," she called, her voice flat and absolute, the voice of someone who had given orders on battlefields where the only reply was screaming. Jake, her shift partner, appeared with a handheld light, his former Army medic training triggering the same reflex that was triggering hers. "Flashlight here," she said, pointing. He positioned it without question, the beam steady as concrete. Dr. Caldwell emerged from the darkness like he'd been summoned, his voice cutting through the chaos with the precision of someone who'd spent his career using words as weapons. "We need to wait for the generators, Sullivan. Proper protocol requires imaging, proper lighting, a sterile field. This is exactly the kind of cowboy medicine that ends in lawsuits. Step back. Brooke didn't step back. She reached for the supply cart with her left hand, her fingers finding the spinal needle by touch alone, the way a musician finds a specific key without looking. The betadine bottle came next. She recognized its shape, its weight, the particular texture of the label under her fingertips. Her movements weren't hesitant. They weren't careful. They were economical and precise, the movements of someone who had performed this procedure 43 times in conditions far worse than these, in hospitals that weren't hospitals at all but converted shipping containers and forward operating bases where the patients didn't have the luxury of waiting for generators and imaging and protocol. "Sullivan, I'm ordering you to stand down," Caldwell said, his voice rising now, the first hint of panic breaking through his authority like a fissure in concrete. "You have no authority to." 14 gauge, Brooke said quietly, addressing no one, addressing everyone. Jake was already reaching for the needle gauge. He understood what she was doing, understood that she was about to thread a spinal needle into the space between the ribs and into the sac surrounding Chen's heart. Betadine on the field. She worked with the kind of speed that made everything look slow. Locate the fifth intercostal space. Mark it with her finger, feeling for the landmarks beneath his skin. Swab with betadine in expanding circles. Jake held the light perfectly steady, his own hands trembling slightly as he watched her move like she was reading from a script written in her bone marrow. The needle went in at a perfect angle, passing between the ribs, through the muscle, finding the pericardial sac. Chen's oxygen saturation was 72% and dropping. 70. 68. The monitor in her mind was ticking down from 3 minutes and she was 90 seconds into a 90-second procedure if her hands didn't betray her, if she hit the mark cleanly, if the darkness didn't lie about anatomy the way it could. The needle breached the pericardium. She felt the give, the way the resistance suddenly vanished like pushing through a membrane. Blood. Dark blood, 30 seconds worth of steady flow, 40 seconds, 60, 75. 120 cc. The pressure released like letting air out of a balloon that was about to burst. Sinus rhythm. The monitor came back first on the portable unit Jake had activated, that familiar reassuring beep, single and clear and then doubled and then the rhythm establishing itself, the heart remembering how to beat. Brooke withdrew the needle, her hands moving to secure the site with a single piece of tape, her movements deliberate and controlled. Chen's oxygen saturation climbed, 75, 82, 88, 94. His blood pressure stabilized at 112/70. She'd done it in 90 seconds. 92 seconds, actually, if you counted the time from recognition to needle withdrawal. 43 previous saves had taught her the math. The muscle memory had taught her the speed. The backup generators kicked in with a low metallic groan, and emergency lighting flooded the ICU in a wash of red that made everything look like it was painted in blood. Dr. Caldwell stood 3 feet away, his face ashen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish that had suddenly found itself on dry land. For a moment, maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed back to life, replacing the red emergency glow with harsh white that showed everything with perfect clarity, Chen's chest rising and falling with the ventilator's support, the betadine stain on his skin, the spinal needle in the trash cup beside the bed, and Brooke Sullivan standing with her hands at her sides, looking at the monitor like it was the most ordinary thing in the world to bring someone back from the edge of nothing. "That's impossible," Caldwell said quietly. Not a statement. A question. A challenge to reality itself. "That technique, where did you?" "His stable," Brooke said, her voice steady as a surgical laser, moving to check Chen's pupils, to verify the line placement, to make sure the darkness hadn't lied about anything else. "I'll monitor his pericardial fluid drainage every 15 minutes. Get cardiothoracic here as soon as communications are back online." Jake was staring at her like he was looking at someone he'd never seen before. She could feel his eyes. She didn't acknowledge them. Instead, she charted what she'd done, pericardiocentesis, needle decompression, fluid output measurement, with the clinical precision of someone documenting a routine procedure. Routine. As if bringing a dying man back from flatline in darkness was something that happened on every shift. By morning, when the sun came through the hospital windows like it was just another day, Caldwell had made his phone calls. Brooke wasn't there to watch the board members arrive, but she heard about it from the nurse who'd overheard the conversation in his office. 3 calls, 3 board members, 3 variations of the same message: reckless cowboy medicine, gross deviation from protocols, the kind of independent action that exposed St. Michael's to liability the moment a patient's family decided to sue. He'd already begun drafting the narrative, the story he would tell to protect himself from what he'd witnessed in the dark: a nurse performing trauma surgery with the muscle memory of someone who had no business working in a civilian hospital, someone who possessed the kind of knowledge that only came from places the Joint Commission never audited and the medical board never licensed. By noon, Caldwell had arranged for an outside surgical consultant. By evening, he'd contacted nursing school references with carefully worded leading questions about her clinical judgment. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended his career. But first, it would take everything Brooke had left. By noon, the machinery of institutional power had already turned against her. Brooke sat in the administrator's office while Marcus Chen, the same administrator who'd smiled at her during hospital orientation 3 years ago, wouldn't meet her eyes as he read the termination letter aloud, his voice the careful tone of someone reciting words written by someone else. An outside surgical consultant had been hired that morning, flown in from UCLA Medical Center specifically to review her entire file, her every procedure, her every decision compressed into a predatory audit. The consultant's report would arrive by end of business, a document that didn't exist yet but whose conclusion had already been decided by 3 board members whose names appeared in Caldwell's contact list, men whose loyalty to the cardiology wing's benefactor ran deeper than any oath to patient safety. Brooke's nursing school in Portland had received 2 separate calls. The first came from a woman identifying herself as the hospital's credentialing officer, asking pointed questions about whether Brooke had always demonstrated sound clinical judgment during her didactic training and whether her instructors had ever expressed concerns about her tendency to act outside her scope of practice. The second call arrived an hour later from someone claiming to be from the state nursing board, asking whether Brooke's original licensure application had included any gaps or discrepancies, a subtle legal threat designed to plant seeds, to create a paper trail suggesting her credentials were questionable, that her entire career was built on a foundation of doubt. Her old instructor, Dr. Patricia Halloway, had called Brooke's personal cell immediately after. "Brooke, something's wrong. They're asking questions that don't make sense. They want to know if you were ever flagged for excessive autonomy or safety concerns. I told them you were the most careful student I ever trained," but Brooke had ended the call gently. There was nothing Halloway could do. The narrative was already being constructed, brick by brick, lie by lie, the architecture of her destruction built by people who'd never met her but understood the power of insinuation. By 11:45, the administrator had the board's written approval sitting in front of him on his desk. Caldwell hadn't even bothered to hide it. His uncle's influence moved through the institution like a current, invisible but absolute. 3 board members had signed off on the termination before the sun cleared the hospital's roofline. Not an investigation. Not a review. A done deal. The consultant's report wouldn't matter. The questioning phone calls wouldn't matter. The decision was already made. They just needed the appearance of process, the thin veil of procedural legitimacy that would protect St. Michael's if Brooke ever decided to fight back. Which she wouldn't. Because fighting back meant revealing things that had to stay buried. Security arrived at her station at noon. Not a supervisor, not a manager, actual security, 2 men in Navy uniforms with radios clipped to their belts, standing far enough away to be discreet but close enough that everyone in the ICU understood what was happening. The message was clear and brutal: you are a threat now. Brooke was escorted from the unit with her personal items in a cardboard box, a stethoscope, 3 scrub caps, a water bottle with the hospital logo, the tarnished military challenge coin that had lived in her locker since 2019, tucked between the pocket lining and the metal frame. The termination letter was printed on official letterhead, single-spaced, clinical in its language, gross deviation from established protocols during a crisis situation, unauthorized performance of a physician-only procedure, reckless endangerment of patient safety, insubordination and refusal to comply with direct orders from attending physician. Every word had been chosen to sound reasonable, to sound like they were protecting patients, to sound like she'd been the danger all along. The walk from the ICU to the employee exit took 47 seconds. Brooke counted them. 12 nurses didn't look at her. 3 residents turned their backs. 1 respiratory therapist, a woman named Sarah who'd worked night shifts with her for 2 years, mouthed the words "I'm sorry" from across the unit. Brooke nodded once. "Not your fault." The hallway smelled like bleach and antiseptic, the same smell that had become as familiar to her as her own breathing, and now it felt like she was being erased from it, like the hospital was already overwriting her presence with someone else's hands, someone else's competence, someone else's name on the assignment board. The security officers didn't speak. They just walked behind her, their shoes clicking on tile in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. By 1 o'clock, Brooke was alone in the hospital laundry room on the basement level, folding her scrubs with the same precision she'd used for 43 combat saves and 718 shifts in the ICU. The industrial washers hummed around her, a sound like the ventilators upstairs, the same mechanical breathing that had become the soundtrack of her life. She'd come back here because she needed to be invisible, because the basement laundry room was the one place in St. Michael's where no one ever checked, where she could move through the hospital without being seen, like a ghost in scrubs. Her hands moved automatically, fold the top down, align the sleeves, crease the bottom, stack them neatly, smooth out every wrinkle like she was preparing a body for burial, which, she supposed, she was. The body of Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, the identity she'd been allowed to wear for 7 years, the smallest version of herself, the quietest lie. Before that, there had been other names, other faces, other lives that hadn't lasted long enough to accumulate scars. Reaper 6. That was who she'd been in Bagram. That was who she'd been in 2019, before everything went sideways on a mission that no longer officially existed, before the Pentagon had decided that certain failures needed to be erased, before she'd been ordered to disappear, before she'd accepted a smaller, invisible life as the price of survival. The challenge coin was still in her pocket. She pulled it out now, letting the basement light catch the tarnished silver, feeling the weight of it, 40 grams, the density of 7 years, the density of every identity she'd ever lost. The coin bore no unit designation anymore, nothing that could connect it to SEAL Team 3, nothing that could prove she'd ever been anything more than a nurse. She'd filed away the raised insignia herself, night by night, year by year, sanding it down until the coin looked like the kind of thing any veteran might carry, meaningless to anyone who didn't understand what the worn edges represented. 43 combat saves. That was what the coin meant. 43 lives that had walked away from operating theaters in Kandahar and Helmand province because her hands had known how to move in the dark, how to find arterial bleeders by touch alone, how to make decisions when there was no attending to ask permission from, when the only rule was survival. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Caldwell had been right about one thing: she didn't belong in his hospital. Not because she was incompetent. Because she was overqualified by 7 years, trained to move in combat zones, trained to think faster than bureaucracy allowed, trained to save lives when every system was failing. She'd known that every time she'd put on the civilian scrubs, every time she'd taken orders from physicians who'd never held a human heart in their hands, every time she'd pretended that protocols mattered more than patients. She'd accepted the humiliation as the cost of staying invisible, of keeping the truth buried, of being allowed to save one life at a time instead of admitting that she'd already saved dozens in places that didn't appear on maps. The laundry room's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing like insects trapped in glass, and Brooke thought about Lieutenant Chen's eyes when his oxygen saturation had climbed to 88%, thought about the moment his color had returned, the moment she'd known he was going to live because she'd done the math in her head in 3 seconds, needle angle, pressure gradient, how much blood was compressing his heart, how long his brain could survive at current oxygen levels. Those calculations weren't something a civilian nurse learned in nursing school. Those calculations came from 43 prior attempts, from the muscle memory of survival. And now they'd fired her for those calculations, for doing exactly what she'd been trained to do, for being exactly who she'd spent 7 years learning not to be. The termination letter said gross deviation from established protocols. What it meant was, you revealed yourself. What it meant was, you can't hide anymore, and we can't let you stay, because you know too much and can do too much and might remind everyone that protocols exist for administrators, not for patients. She folded the last scrub shirt, placed it on top of the stack, and held the challenge coin up to the light one more time. In 48 hours, she would know whether the Navy had forgotten about her, whether Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan was truly erased from the records, whether the identity she'd been forced to abandon in 2019 would stay buried. For now, she stood in a basement laundry room with her hand steady and her breathing even and the weight of 7 identities pressing down on her shoulders, and she waited to see who would come looking for the woman they'd just fired, not understanding that they'd just made the most dangerous mistake of their careers. The parking lot was empty at 9:15 in the morning. Brooke pulled her sedan into a space near the employee entrance, cut the engine, and sat for 30 seconds listening to the tick of cooling metal. Her security badge lay on the passenger seat, the hospital ID photo from 3 years ago staring up at her with eyes that belonged to someone else. She'd been fired before. Once in 2009 by a VA hospital administrator who discovered her medical knowledge exceeded what a nurse should reasonably possess. Once in 2014 by a clinic director who'd asked too many questions about her resume gaps. This was the 3rd time, but the first time it felt like erasure was complete. She opened the car door. The San Diego morning was already hot, asphalt radiating heat like a landing zone. Her hand moved to her pocket, fingers finding the tarnished challenge coin, its edges worn smooth by 5 years of pocket carry. The metal was warm. She was halfway across the asphalt when she heard her son's voice cutting through the ambient hum of the city. "Mom! Mom, wait!" Marcus ran toward her, 16 years old with her dark eyes and his father's long stride, carrying something wrapped in a shadow box. His breathing came hard. "You can't go back in there empty-handed. You can't let him win." She turned. "Marcus, go home. I grabbed it this morning. The one you said never to touch." He thrust the box toward her, his hands trembling with the kind of adolescent rage that came from watching someone you loved get erased. Inside the glass, she could see the edges of it, the uniform jacket, the medals, the photographs from a life she'd been legally required to forget. "They need to know." Brooke took the shadow box from his hands without a word. The weight of it felt like gravity shifting. The automatic doors of St. Michael's slid open. The lobby was warmer than outside, cooler than the asphalt, suspended in that liminal space where glass buildings hover between climates. Brooke's jaw tightened by a millimeter, the only visible reaction her face would allow. 30 feet ahead, at the information desk, stood Lieutenant Chen on crutches. His color was good. Oxygen-saturated pink in his cheeks, steadiness in his shoulders that hadn't been there 2 days ago when his heart had stopped beating in the darkness. Around him stood 6 men in civilian clothes, jeans, polo shirts, baseball caps, but they moved like a unit. Like people who'd trained their bodies to respond to unspoken commands. Like a SEAL team at rest, which was not rest at all but rather a state of perpetual readiness disguised as casualness. When Chen saw her, his entire body recognized something. His eyes widened. "That's Reaper 6, he said clearly, his voice carrying across the marble floor and the fountain and the pressed flower arrangement in the center of the lobby. Not a question. A statement of fact. The lobby went quiet in that specific way that meant everyone had heard. The 70-year-old security guard named Thompson stood behind the desk, Vietnam vet with silver at his temples and the bearing of a man who'd spent 40 years distinguishing between people who belonged and people who didn't. He stepped forward, squinting at the name tape visible through the shadow box glass. His entire frame shifted. His hand moved to his chest. His posture became what it must have been in 1968, spine straight, shoulders back, the physical grammar of respect for rank. "Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan," he said. The words hung in the air like a defibrillator paddle that had just restarted time itself. A man in dress whites, 2-star admiral, insignia bright enough to read from across the lobby, face weathered in the specific way that comes from command decisions at sea, stepped forward from where he'd been standing beside Chen. He was in his early 60s, maybe, with the kind of presence that made the fluorescent light seem dimmer by contrast. He took the shadow box from Brooke's hands with the care of someone handling classified documents. His voice filled the lobby without raising. It didn't need to. Authority is a frequency that doesn't require volume. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism under fire. He opened the jacket, reading the citation. 2 silver stars. A pause. Purple heart with 3 clusters. He removed a sealed envelope from the pocket. The wax was still intact. Pentagon seal. Classified commendation for medical heroism under hostile fire. Saving 17 lives when her field hospital was overrun outside Bagram, Afghanistan, 2019. Nurses Brooke had worked with for 3 years gathered near the elevator. Doctors stopped at the coffee station. A local news crew, they'd come to film Chen's recovery story, that feel-good angle about the SEAL who'd survived the odds, turned their camera. The anchor's eyes went wide. This was no longer a recovery story. This was something else. Chen spoke into the absolute silence. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd watched a stranger perform a miracle in darkness. Master Chief Sullivan died legally so the rest of us could survive. She took the blame for a mission failure to protect her unit. The Pentagon erased her. She's been gone for 5 years. He paused. I wouldn't be standing here without her. 10 seconds elapsed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of the sound of recalibration, of every person in that lobby recategorizing the woman they'd seen carrying charts and wiping monitors for 3 years. Dr. Caldwell stood frozen by the nurse's station. His clipboard had fallen to his side. His face had gone the color of seafloor. He was doing the calculation in real time, understanding that the quiet nurse he'd publicly humiliated, that he'd systematically erased from the hospital, that he'd had escorted out by security 24 hours ago, that woman was none of these things. The Admiral turned toward him. Are you Dr. Caldwell? Caldwell nodded. He shouldn't have nodded. Nodding was an admission. You're terminated effective immediately for retaliating against a decorated Master Chief Petty Officer of the United States Navy. Security will escort you out. The Admiral's voice had the kind of finality that couldn't be appealed or negotiated. It was the voice of someone whose authority came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Your privileges at this hospital are revoked. Your employment is concluded. The security guard had already moved. Thompson placed his hand gently on Caldwell's elbow, not rough, just firm, the way you guide someone who doesn't understand they're supposed to leave. Caldwell's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He was experiencing the specific sensation of watching his entire constructed hierarchy collapse in real time, in front of assembled staff, in front of a news camera. The Admiral turned back to Brooke. His eyes were the color of Atlantic water at depth. Master Chief, we're launching a combat-to-civilian medical transition program at Naval Medical Center San Diego. We need someone to direct it who understands both worlds. Would you consider the position? Brooke's voice, when it came, had shifted. It wasn't the deferential murmur of the fired nurse. It was lower now, an octave deeper, the frequency of someone accustomed to command. Yes, sir. Good. He extended his hand. His grip was like iron wrapped in linen. Welcome back, Master Chief. The hospital lobby went from dead silent to a sound like a held breath finally released, whispers, phone notifications, the small sounds of a world that had just remembered it was still turning. Thompson remained at attention. Chen smiled for the first time since his monitor had flatlined. The news crew's camera kept rolling, because they understood they were filming the moment a ghost became flesh again. Brooke stood in the center of that marble floor, holding her shadow box, her service record visible through the glass, the tarnished challenge coin still heavy in her pocket, and felt the weight of every identity she'd ever carried finally, impossibly, come home. The Admiral's voice cut through the lobby like a blade through silk. Dr. Caldwell, you're terminated effective immediately for retaliating against a decorated Master Chief. He didn't raise his volume. Didn't need to. Security will escort you out. The words hung in the marble-floored silence. Caldwell's face drained of color, first red, then white, then the shade of ash. His jaw opened and closed without sound. The two-star admiral, his uniform immaculate, his presence like gravity itself, simply turned away. Security was already moving, 2 officers in navy blazers flanking the frozen cardiac surgeon who'd built his entire career on the foundation of other people's humiliation. Caldwell's mouth worked. I'm sorry, but no one heard him anymore. The news crew's camera tracked him as he stumbled backward, his expensive shoes squeaking on the tile floor that he'd walked for 18 years as an untouchable man. The security officers didn't touch him. They didn't need to. They moved with the certainty of men who understood authority, and Caldwell followed them toward the glass doors, the same exit Brooke had left through just 24 hours earlier, alone and fired, her career burning behind her like the city at dusk. The fluorescent lights overhead reflected off his scalp as he walked out into the San Diego afternoon, his uncle's phone calls already echoing in his mind, his entire architecture of power collapsing like a house built on sand. By 10:27 a.m. the next morning, hospital IT had deactivated his credentials. His badge no longer opened secure doors. His electronic signature was deleted from the system. His name was scrubbed from the surgical schedule that had once been his kingdom. By noon, the video had 40,000 views across local news sites, decorated Navy Master Chief vindicated, hospital surgeon fired for retaliation. The headline moved through the medical community like a contagion, spreading from San Diego General to Scripps to UC San Diego Medical Center. His uncle, the board member whose name had protected him for 17 years, called once at 2:15 p.m. Caldwell heard the disappointment in his voice before the words even came. Richard, the family name has been embarrassed enough. Don't contact me again. The line went dead. Caldwell sat at his kitchen island in his Del Mar home, the Rolex on his wrist suddenly feeling like a millstone. Medical licenses took months to revoke, navigating California Board of Medicine bureaucracy, but hospital privileges disappeared instantly, like smoke. By week 2, the California Medical Board opened an investigation into his surgical outcomes, the ones Brooke had questioned in her quiet way, the complications he'd attributed to nursing incompetence, the mortality rates that had always been slightly higher than peer averages but smoothed over by his family connections. By week 8, 3 former nurses filed formal complaints documenting retaliation. By month 3, his malpractice insurance premiums tripled, the carriers reading the same video everyone else had seen. By month 4, no hospital in San Diego would credential him. His calls to colleagues went unreturned. His name disappeared from CME committees. He became invisible, which was somehow worse than being seen. 6 months after the incident, exactly 182 days, Caldwell sat at a folding table outside Secure Life Insurance in a strip mall in El Cajon, wearing a polo shirt with a company logo embroidered on the pocket. The fabric pulled tight across his shoulders. He'd gained 23 pounds, the kind that comes from driving between strip malls and eating fast food in the car, from the stress of falling and the terrible, unstoppable quality of descent. His laptop screen displayed no appointments. The sales figures for this month would be 3. Last month's had been 0 before a cancellation came through. A former colleague walked past, someone from St. Michael's, someone he'd mentored once, someone who'd laughed at his jokes during conferences. The man saw him and quickly looked away, his pace quickening. Caldwell pretended to study his laptop screen, his fingers hovering above the keyboard with nowhere to go. Inside the insurance office, his supervisor, 27 years old, fresh from San Diego State, wearing dress pants he'd bought at Target, reviewed his sales numbers and frowned. The review was scheduled for Thursday. Caldwell already knew what it would contain: performance warning, probationary period, suggested resignation. The words would be soft. The meaning would be absolute. Across the city, in a different climate entirely, Brooke Sullivan wore her dress uniform to the launch of St. Michael's inaugural veteran hiring initiative. The uniform was pressed with surgical precision, dress blues, the fabric moving like water, her Master Chief anchors catching the light. 73 former corpsmen, medics, and combat medical specialists filled the hospital's auditorium. Some were in wheelchairs. Some bore the invisible weight of things they'd carried through deserts and mountains. Some had hands that trembled with conditions that had no names, and Brooke understood every single tremor because she carried her own. The program would train them for civilian certification while recognizing their field experience, collapsing the gap between military medicine and hospital credentials. Lieutenant Chen attended on crutches, moving with the careful deliberation of someone still learning to exist in a body that worked again. His SEAL team occupied the front row, 5 operators in civilian clothes, their eyes tracking Brooke with the expression of men who understood what she'd done in that ICU darkness. Jake, her former shift partner, now assistant director of the night shift, stood beside her on the stage. He'd written the curriculum. He'd known all along, the Bagram stitch pattern, the field trauma confidence, the way her hands moved like a surgeon operating by muscle memory alone. The hospital director, a woman named Patricia Reeves, introduced the program with a voice that shook slightly when she described the unprecedented courage and sacrifice of those who served. Brooke didn't look at the camera when they filmed her introduction. She looked at the 73 faces in the room, and every single one of them understood what invisibility felt like. Her new office overlooked the ICU where she used to work. The desk was solid oak, nothing like the grey metal station where she'd charted vitals in anonymity. On the desk sat 2 objects, the tarnished challenge coin from Bagram, now displayed in a small black frame, and her hospital credentials in another frame beside it. The nameplate read, Brooke Sullivan, Master Chief Petty Officer, RET, Director of Military Medical Transition Program. Marcus visited after school sometimes, proud finally to tell his classmates what his mother actually did. For 16 years, he'd carried the secret of her strangeness, the military bearing she thought she hid but never quite managed to conceal. Now he could say it out loud, my mom was a Navy SEAL. Chen returned for his 6-month follow-up appointment and brought his entire team. 5 operators walked into her office in dress uniforms, and the tallest one, the team's commanding officer, presented her with a challenge coin from their unit. The coin was new, heavy, the emblem still sharp. On one side, a trident. On the other, a single word, Reaper. She held it without speaking for a full 8 seconds. Chen had told them everything about that moment in the darkness, every detail of how her hands moved, and her voice stayed calm and her eyes never left his monitor. Thompson, the security guard who'd escorted her out with a termination letter, now saluted her every morning when she arrived. He was 71, a Vietnam vet, and something about watching a Master Chief work in scrubs had shifted something in him. She returned his salute with quiet dignity. At the strip mall in El Cajun, Caldwell closed his folding table at 4:27 p.m., having made 0 sales again. He folded the metal legs and carried it to his 12-year-old Camry. The Audi had been repossessed in month 3, the house was in escrow, and his studio apartment cost $480 a week. His supervisor had asked him this morning if insurance was really his passion, which was corporate code for a performance warning delivered in the gentlest possible language. Caldwell sat in the driver's seat and watched a news alert push through on his phone. St. Michael's receives $3.4 million federal grant for Veteran Medical Integration Program, director cited by Pentagon for innovative approach. The photo showed Brooke in dress uniform shaking hands with a U.S. senator. Her expression was neutral, her bearing immaculate, her eyes the color of someone who'd already seen the worst and chose to build something better anyway. Caldwell closed the app and drove to his studio, the radio playing country music he didn't listen to, his mind replaying every decision that had led him here, every humiliation he'd delivered thinking it would stay delivered, every person he'd pushed down believing he'd stay elevated, every assumption that his family name would protect him from the laws that governed everyone else. Brooke stood in the ICU observation window that evening, watching the night shift work through the glass. One of the nurses was a former Air Force pararescueman, hired 3 months ago through her program. He moved with the same efficient economy she recognized from her own reflection, the kind of grace that came from having performed emergency medicine under fire, from understanding that wasted motion meant wasted blood. He was running a code on a 78-year-old man with acute MI, pushing epinephrine on schedule, managing the airway with the confidence of someone who'd done it in Kandahar with incoming fire 200 meters out. The patient converted to sinus rhythm. The room exhaled collectively. Brooke touched the challenge coin in her pocket, the tarnished one, the one that had survived everything, the one that stayed with her through every identity, every reinvention, every moment of erasure and resurrection. On its face, barely visible beneath the patina of time, an inscription, Reaper 6, when others quit. She thought of something her commanding officer had told her in Bagram, in the medical tent before the last mission went sideways, before the Pentagon buried the whole operation and scrubbed her records clean. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. That's the difference between us and them. Brooke returned to her office where 17 more veteran applications waited for review. 17 people who'd served, who'd sacrificed, who understood what it meant to be invisible, and who deserved someone who understood that too. She opened the first file and began to read. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in Brooke's position?